Hello, everyone. That's the next episode of our C100 Global Wisdom Talk. And today's episode, it will be just a very great episode, I can promise you, because I have invited Jennifer Wines. And Jennifer Wines is just the author of a very, very impressive and great book. It's called Invisible Wealth. And before we jump into the content of the book, Jennifer, can you introduce you briefly for the audience? That will be great.
Absolutely. Jen, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the kind words as well. As mentioned, my name is Jennifer. Last name is Wines, like a glass of wine. People sometimes call me Jen. And you're right. I wrote the book titled Invisible Wealth, which I'm really looking forward to delving in with you today on that. So, yeah.
So, Jennifer, I'm very curious. What was the tipping point for you? Because you're coming just from the other side of wealth. You're coming from the financial side. What was the tipping point to write a book about the qualitative capital forms, what you call the invisible wealth?
It's a great question and one that I get often, as you can imagine, and one that I ask myself before leaving the advisor role and to do exactly this. And so, yeah, it gives me a good opportunity to share a little bit about myself, just
Yeah.
so you have a sense for the lens through which I'm approaching our conversation. So basically, I've been in the world of wealth for the entirety of my career thus far. So after graduating from law school, I passed the bar and I got a job offer to join Goldman Sachs in their private wealth management group. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I wasn't thinking I was going to go this direction, but after what felt like 14 million interviews at Goldman, I got the opportunity to join them in their wealth management group. And that set me on the trajectory of all things wealth management ever since. And been at some other great institutions like JPMorgan Private Bank as well, most recently Fidelity Private Wealth Management. And I'll tell you, when I was in the wealth advisor seat, it was through thousands of client conversations with ultra high net worth individuals, with their families, that I started to notice something. And I started to notice that mindsets were shifting, right? So mindsets were shifting with my clients and also quite candidly within myself as we're all kind of collectively reconceptualizing what wealth is. And saw this through these conversations, people wanting to like in effect revisit and redefine what wealth is. And so I was like, oh, this is quite interesting, particularly because I have such an affinity and love for the written word from law school. And so I was like, what is wealth actually? When we take a look back, like what does the word wealth actually mean? Um, and so it was through this kind of curiosity and exploration, I thought to myself, something special is happening here. And this propelled me to decide to leave a really great company, a really great team, and really great clients in order to fully dedicate myself to researching, what is wealth, both practically and philosophically. So I'll lead with that and just say that it was through these client conversations and really recognizing that there was a shift going on, that people are wanting to revisit and redefine what wealth is and traverse into the arena of intangible assets just the same as the tangibles.
That's great. So, can you give us just what is wealth actually, and what kind of forms of capital have you found?
Mm. So I'll say this. So if we think about what is invisible wealth, right? Let's take a first principles approach to this question. What I mean by that is I'll break that down into two distinct parts. And to answer your first question is what is wealth? And then I'll get to what is invisible wealth, which goes more to the different kind of asset classes, if you will. So if we think about the question, what is wealth? We can take a look back and we'll see, and what I detailed in the book is that the word wealth came into our lexicon in the mid 13th century from England, over your side of the pond. And it came from the root well, W-E-L-E or W-E-A-L, depending on the source, and in effect meant health and well-being. So wealth found its definitional roots in wealth, I mean, health and well-being, and really embody this essence of happiness, right? But what happened is that over time, our concept of wealth changed because money got more sophisticated, and as a result, so too did the economies. So you have money becoming more sophisticated, economies becoming more sophisticated, which really meant that money and wealth evolved to mean, in effect, one and the same. And so right now, I think we have this rare opportunity to revisit and reconceptualize what wealth is because we have a new set of technological advancements and societal shifts underway, which are really inviting us to revisit and redefine what we value and why. And I bring up value because in Invisible Wealth, I put forth the idea, or I write about the idea, that we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value. So the question then really becomes, what do we value and why? And these days, Jan, from what I've seen, firsthand through client conversations and what I'm feeling myself personally, and folks like yourself, and people within this ecosystem, we're all seeing this shift happen, that people are really revisiting and reconceptualizing what they value and wanting to place a premium on the intangible assets of their life, more so than ever before. So we're kind of like reverting back to the kind of older concept of wealth, which is actually in effect well-being.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. I'm totally with you. So, I mean, your book was my personal touching point to you. I've read the book and I was fascinated because it reminds me also. I mean, on the great books what Jay Hughes was written, and he is similar describing what wealth actually is. And can you tell me just a little bit about your story? What kind of feedback have you get over the last 18 and 24 months if your book was published? Was it more positive, or was it, yeah, please come up with other stuff? What, what was the feedback actually?
That's a great question. So perhaps, I mean, you've read the book, right? And thank you for ordering it and indulging. That it means the world to me. And I hope it resonated, which I think it did at some level. So what I'll say too, just for those who haven't read, let me walk through the principles just so people have a concept of what
Yeah,
the principles are. So basically, we have this multidimensional interpretation of what wealth is, right? So if we're wealthy when we have an abundance, the question then becomes, what do you value and why? Okay, so for consideration, I take this abstraction, right? And I wanted to create a framework to make it much more approachable, because how do we take this big abstract concept such as invisible wealth and really map it onto our lives in a meaningful way? And so that's why the five principles come in handy. And so those five principles are: first is money and investment, which many would imagine. The second is health and quality of life. The third is knowledge, status, influence. The fourth is time, energy, and experiences. And the fifth, last but absolutely not least, is relationship with self and others.
yes,
These are the five principles. They're, as you can see, they're groups of assets which are designed thoughtfully, pairings of assets that we all go through life wanting to attain more of, albeit perhaps at different points in times in our lives, right? So, for example, I think that we can collectively agree that everyone values money, right? Everyone values health. Everyone values knowledge. Everyone values time. Everyone values relationships. This isn't a new concept, but sometimes a framework to a concept helps us to kind of conceptualize it and apply it to our lives. So, with that, when I've been socializing this idea and this framework, as you said, over the past, say, 18 months or so, by virtue of like speaking engagements and workshops and things of the like, and with various individuals, there's definitely an inherent receptivity, because I think, again, these are all kind of innately valuable assets to us.
yeah,
Although perhaps we don't think of it through the lens of them being assets, for example, um, which I'm hoping that we can kind of change the language and change the mindset that in effect, yeah, and I don't think anyone would argue either, but health is an asset, time is an asset, your relationships are an asset. And so there's been great receptivity in terms of the structure. There's also been great receptivity as it relates to using values to understand what you value, right? So there's this invitation to think about, okay, if your values determine what you value, perhaps looking at your values first is productive in order to inform which of these five principles you might be prioritizing at a certain point in time in your life and why. And so here's the thing: when we value something, it innately gains importance. And if something's important, it gains priority, right? And if something's a priority, then it's usually pegged to or tied to a goal. So really it all stems from your values lead to value, which leads to importance, which leads to priority, which leads to a goal. And what I term a wealth goal, perhaps it's a quantitative wealth goal, perhaps it's a qualitative wealth goal. Wealth goals can sound different, right? A wealth goal can sound like, I want X% of return on my portfolio by this time frame. Or it could sound like, I want to allocate this amount of time with my kids for the next 5 years, right? Wealth goals can sound different. So it's figuring out, how do we take these various assets within the 5 principles, and how are we creating a life that's wanting to optimize or focus on the right assets, and why, predicated on our values. So again, I think that it's one of these things where everyone can kind of relate to this or appreciate the concept, in which case it's gotten a lot of great reception. And sometimes it's thinking about things like frameworks are really helpful, right? Outlines are very helpful. Visuals are very helpful. So I think it's just taking some tools to provide a framework to an abstraction that's quite familiar to all of us.
So I've experienced this if I just approach my family or just buy a wealth brain or stuff like that. Um, in many cases, I mean, if you raise the question, okay, what is your purpose? What is your legacy and stuff like that? You look in empty eyes. It is what it is. And I often, and I will pick up just these interesting um, form of capital, these wealth of knowledge, status, and influence. Can you give me just an example? How is it actually practicable, executable if I want to be more influential? I mean, knowledgeable, okay, yes, I can learn a lot, but what will be the right knowledge, what I should pick up? Is there just a North Star, what should be structured that each of these capital forms will be focused on the North Star, or is it just independent?
It's a great question, and you pick up on something, and it's funny because I'm writing, or just finished writing rather, my next Substack newsletter on this third principle, knowledge, status, influence, and because I'm doing one per month for each of the principles starting at the beginning of the year. And it's also funny because this is the principle that gets the most head scratches, the most inquiry. People are like, yuck, why did you include status and influence? I mean, they don't say it directly like that, but there's a lot of curiosity. And the reason I think that is because people have a little bit of an antiquated concept of what status and influence is, I personally believe. So just the same as we're revisiting and redefining wealth, I think it's an opportunity to revisit and redefine status and influence. And so I'll walk through this pairing with you, the knowledge, status, and influence, because they all fortify and support one another, and perhaps it'll make more sense that way. So you're right. There's so much information these days, that then we can braid with our experiences and intuition to create knowledge, right? And we have unprecedented information at our fingertips these days by virtue of the internet and technological advancements, right? So what's happening is that we have all this information at our fingertips, growing at exponential rates. As a consequence, so too is our knowledge. And this is often referred to as the knowledge doubling curve. So this was a coin turned by Buckminster Fuller to describe the accelerating rate of human expansion, human knowledge rather. And so this doubling curve has an interesting paradox in the sense that there's so much information that's coming online that we can use to create knowledge, although there's so much that we almost can't apply it as quickly as we want to, coupled with the fact that the lifespan of this information is decreasing. Okay, so that's interesting. So now it's becoming this interesting thing where people, we should all be thinking about, like, what information are we absorbing? How are we adapting, and how are we acting on this information or this knowledge, just given the scale and the velocity of change underway? Okay, so we're all gaining a ton of knowledge, right? Great, but it's actually, what do we do with this knowledge that's the most beneficial? Because the real value, right, to get back to value, of knowledge is unlocked when you use it. So Jan, you might set out to gain knowledge by virtue of reading, these books that you do, and or talking to your clients and those in your ecosystem. Um, or, someone might want to read a book on how to raise their kids from an informed place. It's really the application of this knowledge that helps to unlock its value. Fantastic. And we can use this to create value for ourselves and or for other people.
Yeah.
So that's where we get into status. All right. And status is fascinating because, listen, everything is relative and status is no exception, right? So a person's status is going to be relative to that amongst their peers, within their society, within their community. And that's why we often think about status in terms of social status, because it is in effect socially oriented. And it's for this reason that we can also think about this form of an asset as social capital, right? That can be wielded for productive good. And when I say productive, I mean productive for society, for the integrity of the communities that we're in. And this is the thing, and this is why I think many people get the yuck, because once upon a time, status was granted to those born into the right family, right? They were granted to kings, to queens, to aristocrats. Um, and these folks perhaps would signal their status within society through status symbols, such as like wearing a purple royal cloak, for example. That's why we have the term royal purple, right? And so back then, status wasn't something necessarily that you earned, but it was more so it was granted to you. Although a lot has changed since then. And that's why I think we need to revisit and reconceptualize what status is. So now status can be attained through what I call the 4 A's. So it can be attained through abilities, achievement, affiliations, and associations. So these are 4 ways that we can attain status. If we want to take it up even one notch further, status can be attained by providing value to others, right? To taking our information and sharing it with others. So this reconceptualization of status, I believe, is largely due to the technological advancements and societal shifts that are underway. And we have things like social media, which are able to help, right, to fortify and amplify this. And also society is just much more interested in giving and receiving information to each other, or rather knowledge, in productive ways, right? So status has shifted from that of those born into nobility to those who are actually wanting to pursue noble pursuits. So it's different. And those wanting to contribute to the fabric of society, those wanting to take status and interpret it in a more higher octave interpretation of what status is. And then finally, I'll get to influence, and I would love all your thoughts as I just finished unpacking this. Influence, well, you can leverage the assets of knowledge and status to then attain influence, okay? So influence is the ability to affect another person's thoughts or actions, their beliefs and the behaviors. Or said differently, it's the ability to sway, to motivate, right? To inspire people. And this is really powerful when paired with productive, pure intention. And so one way, again, to scale this positive influence is through the internet. It's through social media. And in the past, like all influence was local, but now we're able to amplify status on a global stage. And as a consequence, actually, and this is one last thing I'll get to here, folded into the family office stuff. So people are also leaning into this whole concept of personal brand. Like, how do you build a personal brand? Because you can use a personal brand to help to scale your influence on a global scale. And what's fascinating is that people are now branding themselves just like companies always have, right? Or people are thinking about themselves in terms of what value do they provide, like companies are thinking about what values do I provide, right? So there's this interesting inversion that's going on. And I think entrepreneurship, the creator economy, all rely on knowledge, status, and influence. And again, society is granting status and influence to those who are wanting to contribute positively to the fabric of society. One brief anecdote, and then I'll take a pause here, is that I was just in London and I was meeting with this woman who does branding for family offices, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And we can delve into that a little bit deeper, but I think that that kind of just goes to show that, family offices are wanting to figure out how do they show up in the broader global stage, right? And how are they showing up and why? How are they using status and influence perhaps for productive good?
That's interesting, and I'm totally with you. Um, I would be curious, Jennifer, if you're describing these, for instance, these wealth of knowledge, status and influence, health, quality of life, and the others. Is it just that you are also take a look of the internal construction of the family, that each of these capitals are between each family members, and then in the second step, externally? Because if you have this just developed on a very strong base, you will be stronger for the society with your influence and relevance.
So let me play this back to you to make sure that I'm getting it right. So you're saying that how every individual perhaps thinks about these five principles. Is that what you're
It's
getting at?
it's more. I mean, if I take a look, if I describe just a family as an enterprise, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm,
I would describe all these forms of qualitative capital are by and large the culture of the family, or describing the culture of the family, the
mhm,
strong or weak or whatever it is. And it is often very, very tough. I mean, if you are just a principal and you have your daughter, your son or your spouse on the other side, and you ask yourself, okay, how I can strange the relationship inside of the family. I mean, that's often, very often, a very big challenge, right?
mhm, mhm.
And
Yeah.
and also, I mean, it comes not that I have the status just as the leader of the family, but in the end of the day, yes, you have these status inside of the family, and these status need acceptance of from the family members. I'm more curious, um, how I can imagine, how I can implement, how I can improve. If I've, in many cases, I sit there and say, yeah, that's absolutely right. Great. And now what? What can I do that I can potentially strange my relationship inside of the family, right? What should I do? What should I do? And then if we have strange all these forms, what you described of these invisible principles inside of the family, and we are more strong as a family for the society.
Mhm, mhm.
How I can, or how can you describe this? In what system or structure? I guess you have developed just a framework. Um,
Mhm.
can you give us just a little bit deep dive, or just an example on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So so you're right. There's a kind of a culture, right, to every family ecosystem, which is fascinating. And what motivates or informs that is the values of each individual within that ecosystem. And so I think what's interesting and what we've talked about before, you and I know it's definitely mentioned in the book, is this great wealth transfer underway. So we have this great wealth transfer that's going to place $105 trillion into the hands of the next generation by 2048. That's the new number as of December, which is absolutely wild. And so this wealth transfer is inviting us to think about within the family ecosystem, how do we transfer value and values? How do we transfer both the quantitative and the qualitative assets that a family is comprised of?
Yeah.
And so first you need to identify like what assets does a family hold? What values do a family hold in order to understand how to transfer them? Because you can't transfer what you don't have, right? So like if you don't have certain values, they're not going to transfer down. So it's having a really good look on an individual basis, I think, first and foremost, to see what are Jan's values relative to his daughter, relative to his son, and to start to unpack that and to understand, okay, if you, one of your core values is freedom, do you tend to think about freedom as it relates to money, as it relates to health, as it relates to knowledge, as it relates to time, as it relates to relationships? Is it one? Is it all of them? Is it none of the above, right? So to figure out what's the storyline behind those values and how they map onto various assets, I think is productive. So it's really, in my mind, it's an individual exploration first and foremost, and then to understand, once you have that insight, how does that interface with other people within the family? Because you're right, navigating these generational differences they're dynamic, of course, but it really comes down to building the cohesion between these differing perspectives, because cohesion creates harmony, right? And the reality is that everyone has their own relationship with wealth, because we all approach wealth through our own complex matrix of being. So it doesn't really matter if we're born into the same family, and we all have different experiences, right? Um, and so when you take this complexity on an individual basis and you consider it within the family system, I mean, of course, that's going to compound the complexity. But with that comes optionality, with that comes potential to explore these differences, to really flush out what is our culture, what is our narrative, what is our legacy, and to offer these differing perspectives each the opportunity to come to the table, proverbially speaking and literally speaking, by virtue of family meetings and family conversations, right? Um, Offsites, even informal meetings, and to keep these conversations going. But again, I think first and foremost, it starts with the individual, which is the work that I love to do. It starts with the individual, and then how does that fold into the broader ecosystem?
Okay, okay. And can you give us just our audience also? I mean, if you are working with a family, right? What do you actually do with the whole ecosystem, and what do you found in most cases? Is it just the desert or chaos? What is it actually?
It's a great question. So my work predominantly is with individuals within a family. Okay, so that's kind of my forte. That's where I love. And there's many people who do brilliant work with the family ecosystem. Um, and listen, I did that at Fidelity with clients, with the family ecosystem, and it's fascinating. But again, for me, I really like to understand, like, what are people's values? What are they valuing? How are they organizing their lives as a consequence? And how does that relate to the broader system that they're in, whether that's the family, society, whatever the case may be. So what's interesting is that I think that we have a mindset shift from one generation to the next. So the next generation, or rising gen, if you will, or the people who are making a lot of money by virtue of creating a business and then selling it, right? So they're first time wealth creators. These types of individuals tend to have a little bit of a different mindset, just because they've grown up, I guess, if you want to use the word, in a different ecosystem where there are technological advancements and societal shifts at play. And so what I've thought through, and through research and obviously conversation, there's in effect four mindsets that I see going on for the next generation. Those four mindsets are: one, authenticity and transparency, right? People are really valuing that in a newfound way. The second is education and empowerment. The third is values and purpose, right? We have a really values-oriented generation coming online. And then the fourth is innovation and entrepreneurship. So people are wanting to step into entrepreneurship. They're wanting to innovate on family businesses. They're wanting to reconceptualize what they want to do, perhaps independent of the family business. So with that, and I think the first is really interesting to double tap on here, is the mindset shift as it relates to authenticity and transparency. Transparency around money, transparency about what are we going to do with these assets, transparency about, actually, I don't really want to go into the family business, and having the ability to have these conversations and lean into the awkward conversations, which honestly, I think have always been a little bit taken off the table, so to speak. Again, just because culture is shifting, mindsets are shifting, times are shifting. And so I think we really need to be conscientious and aware of this acceleration of change and how that impacts how one thinks about wealth in a broader, more abstract, multidimensional perspective, but also having an appreciation for the mindsets of the older generation as well as the younger generation. And again, creating a cohesion, creating a bridge between those two perspectives and taking the best of both
Yeah.
and blending it together. Like that's the end goal, I think. It's like there's lots to be learned from everybody, from everybody. And so I think if we just keep in mind these four mindsets, that will help to inform how perhaps people are coming to these conversations in newfound ways.
And is it just if you are describing these four mindsets, these shifts in the mindset, I am correct if I say that you are potentially have the outlook that we will see more families just from a next generation or raising generation, that there will be more century families with this kind of mindset because they have other foundation and values as the older generations. They are more focused on the qualitative things, not on the quantitative things. Is
Mhm.
this just potentially also your outlook?
Mhm. I think this next generation, you're right. They're more values oriented, in the sense that they want to make money with values in mind, spend money with values in mind, as well as invest money with values in mind, right? And so that's often a point of conversation in terms of how one generation wants to invest relative to another. So um, that more values oriented and more appreciation for the qualitative assets, yes. I don't think that negates the importance of course, just seeking out returns for financial investment, for example, but I think there's different paths forward. So I think the next generation is much more interested in making or creating rather value predicated on values, where historically it's been a little bit of the reverse. So people are kind of like leading with the qualitative perhaps, and seeing how they can then um, make the quantitative through that lens, leading with the qualitative um, to create value. Yeah. But I'm curious, I mean, with all your work and all your conversations, because I know this is a big focus for you, hence the title of your company, right? How do you see families do you think that people are taking a more long-term perspective, or do you think people are like, I have it now and I want to use it and deploy it to the best of my ability while I have it? What's been your perception and experience with that?
So I see an increasing openness, especially on these second and third generation. Not so on the first generation wealth creators. And that's number one. Number two is I see also a mindset shift, what you're describing. Um, and number three is often they're raising their voices and say, okay, where's actually the foundation, the system, the structure that I can build up just in strong family, my own family, over the next 100 years, potentially 200 years, 500 years. Because what you're also describing, these kind of wealth of knowledge. I mean, in the end of the day, all knowledge is there today, right? I mean, go to Google or on YouTube and you will find everything. The question is more, okay, how I can adapt this for me personally, but also for my entire family. And also, on the other side, there are more families are open to share their experience to become just a fifth generation family, or I've heard about a 1,000-year family plan.
Mm,
And at the end of the day, I mean, we need this kind of families. We need
hmm
strong families. They are grounded by values,
hmm
qualitative values, not by quantitative values, because I mean, money is in the end of the day rocket fuel, right? If you don't have the right destination, I mean, your rocket will explode and then it will be gone. So that is just my perception of this, and therefore, what you're describing in your book, it's absolutely requested. It needs to scale on a broader scale, right? That every family have access to consider what is it actually, to have an other perception what wealth actually is. Because on the flip side of this, I mean, you know as better as me, many of these advisors are talking about these old stuff, talking only and only about the money, right? And So therefore, I see that just as my obligation and responsibility to encourage these second and third generation to consider to become just a century family. I mean, we will live longer, right? I mean, it could be that you and I will be reach the 100 years. Yes, we look a little bit different, but in the end of the day, it is possible today, right? And therefore we should consider about this. And that brings me just to my final question today. And it would be much appreciated if we can continue our discussion, what we have started today. And before I forget this, I will put just the link to your newsletter, and it's clearly recommended. I enjoy your newsletter in every time. And my final question for today, Jennifer, is if I have the opportunity to schedule a meeting with you 500 years from now, what will be your outlook? What will be changed for the families, for the society, and potentially for your own family? What is your perception?
Wow.
I
That,
guess that's a tough question, but let's make this experience.
no, this is a wonderful question. I've never thought about this in my life. So, okay, 500 years from now, you're right. Maybe because of all these technological advancements, right? We're going to look like babies and it'll be like Benjamin Button and we'll reverse age and all will be well in the world. But I think, listen, with technology, with AI, which everyone is obviously talking about, is going to invite us to reconceptualize what work is. It's going to have us reconceptualize what value is. And I think that so much that we do on the day to day is going to be relegated to technology. And so, what do we do with all this, free time? What do we do with all this uh, financial, like money creation that happens as a consequence of technology? How do we organize ourselves? And I think that that's fascinating because we're all going to be invited to, again, kind of step into this more the concept of like human flourishing. Like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to connect with people? And so for me, I think in 500 years from now, it's a really exciting time because we are at the epitome relative to today, right? We're at the epitome of humanness. We're at the epitome of connecting based upon values, based upon curiosity, based upon creation, doing the things that we actually want to do, not things that we need to do for purposes of creating money in these old antiquated ways that are like mind numbing, right? It's like, what are the ways that we can create value in a way that's exciting and it's really resonant with our personalities? And we can all go around doing exactly that. And then getting together for like a really nice meal and like hanging out and being human and having conversation. I hope conversation isn't a lost art. So let's keep that going. And with that, thank you so much for this conversation because it's been quite powerful. And one thing I just want to double tap on because you said it earlier, and I think it's really, really profound. I just want to highlight is that you're right. So families and individuals and next gens, they now have these various networks, right? Like your own and ecosystems to help people to navigate these complexities, which and in this arena is only starting to gain more traction. Of course, because of the proliferation of family offices and all of this as well. But it's really, really foundational and important to help make sure that people have the resources that they need, right? The relevant knowledge, as you mentioned, to help inspire and motivate, to influence for good, how people are structuring themselves and why. So I just want to say kudos to you for what you're building and what you're doing with your network because it's very well needed. And I always appreciate connecting with you on these topics.
Jennifer, it was a great pleasure to have you on the talk. And, many thanks. And yes, it's my wish that we can schedule a second talk. I mean, there's so many what we should discuss and bring on the table because it is absolutely requested. Many thanks for your wonderful book and for your exceptional work.
No, my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. And yes, there's lots of richness to unpack here and very much looking forward to the next time. Thank you so much.
Many thanks.